On a bustling Tuesday morning in downtown Chicago, the marble halls of the Cook County Courthouse buzzed with their usual activity. Among the crowd, Officer Richard Thompson strode through the security checkpoint, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who'd testified in countless cases over his 15 years on the force. Today was supposed to be routine, another traffic violation case he needed to support with his testimony. The newly appointed Judge Wilson had taken her position on the bench just 3 months ago, but her reputation for fairness and attention to detail had already spread through the courthouse corridors. A graduate of Harvard Law School and with 20 years of experience as a prosecutor, she had earned her position through dedication and exceptional legal acumen. As Officer Thompson entered courtroom 304, he barely glanced at the judge's bench, his mind preoccupied with the day's numerous commitments. When the bailiff called the court to order, Thompson remained seated, casually checking his phone. The bailiff cleared his throat loudly, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Wilson." Thompson looked up, his eyes widening slightly as he saw Judge Wilson for the first time. He remained seated, his lips curling into a subtle smirk. The courtroom fell silent, the tension palpable as other officers and attorneys quickly rose to their feet, looking uncertainly between Thompson and the judge. Judge Wilson's gaze fixed on Officer Thompson, her expression maintaining professional composure. "Officer Thompson, in my courtroom, we follow proper procedures. Please stand when court is called to order." Her voice was firm but measured, carrying the weight of her authority without aggression. Thompson slowly rose, his movements deliberately casual. "Didn't realize it was mandatory," he muttered, just loud enough to be heard. A few gasps echoed through the courtroom, and the prosecutor's face flushed with embarrassment. "Officer Thompson," Judge Wilson continued, her tone unchanged, "you've served on the force for 15 years, according to your record. Surely you're familiar with courtroom protocol. Your badge represents respect for the law, does it not?" Thompson shifted uncomfortably, but his defiance hadn't completely dissolved. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I've been doing this job since you were probably still in law school." The words came out dripping with condescension. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Wilson raised her gavel, bringing instant silence. Officer Thompson approached the bench. As he walked forward, she continued, "Let me clarify something for you. I graduated from Harvard Law School 20 years ago, served as a prosecutor for 2 decades, and earned this position through merit and dedication to justice. Your assumptions about my qualifications are not only incorrect but inappropriate in this courtroom." Several attorneys nodded in approval, while other police officers present looked visibly uncomfortable with their colleagues' behavior. The defendant and spectators watched the exchange with rapt attention, some recording the interaction on their phones despite the court's rules against it. Furthermore, Judge Wilson continued, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "Your conduct today demonstrates a concerning lack of respect for the judicial system you've sworn to uphold. This isn't about me personally, it's about maintaining the dignity and order of this court. Your behavior suggests you might benefit from a refresher course on courtroom procedures." Thompson's face had grown increasingly red as Judge Wilson spoke. The realization of his mistake began to dawn on him as he noticed the disapproving looks from his fellow officers and the attorneys present. His earlier bravado crumbled under the weight of the judge's measured response and the silent judgment of his peers. Judge Wilson leaned forward slightly, her next words careful and deliberate. "Officer Thompson, I'm ordering you to complete a professional conduct seminar before you may testify in this courtroom again. Your testimony today will be rescheduled. Do you understand?" The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Thompson managed a quiet, "Yes, Your Honor." As he turned to leave, the quiet murmur of approval from the gallery followed him. Several of his fellow officers shook their heads, clearly embarrassed by his conduct. Before he could reach the door, Judge Wilson added, "And Officer Thompson? When you return, I trust you'll remember that this courtroom operates on respect, not assumptions or prejudices. That applies to everyone who enters through those doors, regardless of their position or background. The incident quickly became a talking point throughout the courthouse, spreading through the legal community as an example of how justice and professionalism should prevail over prejudice and disrespect. Judge Wilson's handling of the situation earned her even greater respect among her peers and the public, while Officer Thompson's actions prompted a department-wide review of courtroom conduct procedures. This story would continue to be shared in police training sessions and law schools alike, serving as a powerful reminder that true justice is blind to prejudice and that respect for the law and its representatives must be universal, not selective. The incident sparked important conversations about bias in the justice system and the need for continuous education and self-reflection among all its participants. The video of Officer Thompson's confrontation with Judge Wilson spread like wildfire through social media within hours of the incident. Despite the courthouse's no-recording policy, several spectators had managed to capture the exchange on their phones, and soon local news stations were running the footage on their evening broadcasts. Back at the 15th precinct, Thompson sat in the break room, his untouched coffee growing cold as he watched his face on the small TV mounted on the wall. His colleagues walked past, some avoiding eye contact while others shot disapproving glances his way. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in, made heavier by the disappointed looks from officers he'd worked with for years. "Thompson, my office. Now." Captain Chen's voice cut through the uncomfortable silence. As Thompson followed his superior down the hallway, he could hear whispered conversations starting up behind him. The precinct's usual camaraderie felt distant and cold. Inside the office, Captain Chen closed the door and took a seat behind his desk, his expression grave. "Do you understand what you've done? Not just to yourself, but to this entire department?" He didn't wait for Thompson to respond. "We've spent years building trust with our community, trying to show them that we're better than the stereotypes, and you just confirmed every negative assumption about police bias in less than 5 minutes." Thompson shifted in his chair, his earlier defiance replaced by genuine discomfort. "Captain, I didn't mean to what?" Chen interrupted. "To disrespect a federal judge? To embarrass this department? To demonstrate exactly the kind of behavior we're trying to eliminate?" He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Be honest with yourself, Thompson. Would you have acted the same way if Judge Wilson had been a white man?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Thompson opened his mouth to defend himself but found no words coming out. The truth was uncomfortable, and for the first time, he was forced to confront his own biases head-on. Captain Chen pulled out a folder from his desk drawer. "The police commissioner's office has been flooded with calls since this morning. Civil rights groups are demanding action. The media is asking for statements. Even the mayor's office is involved now." He spread several papers across the desk, formal complaints, news articles, and social media screenshots. This isn't going away with a simple apology. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Wilson was dealing with her own wave of attention. Her chambers had received countless messages of support from colleagues, community leaders, and citizens who admired her composed handling of the situation. Yet, as she sat in her office reviewing case files, her mind kept returning to the deeper implications of the morning's events. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Judge Martinez, her mentor since her early days as a prosecutor. "Got a minute?" he asked, though he was already settling into the chair across from her desk. "Quite a first trimester you're having," Martinez said with a gentle smile. "You know, when I started in '85, this kind of thing happened all the time. The difference is, back then, there were no consequences." He paused, studying her face. "You handled it perfectly, you know that, right?" Judge Wilson sighed, placing her pen down. "I keep wondering if I should have done more. Or less. If I was too harsh or not harsh enough. You showed him exactly what he needed to see: dignity, competence, and authority without losing your composure. That's worth more than any punishment you could have handed down. Martinez leaned forward. But the real work starts now. This incident has opened up a conversation that this courthouse has needed to have for a long time. Back at the precinct, Captain Chen was wrapping up his conversation with Thompson. You're suspended for 2 weeks, without pay. When you return, you'll be required to complete not just the judge's mandated seminar, but also our department's enhanced diversity and bias training program. Additionally, you'll be partnering with Officer Washington in community outreach for the next 6 months. Thompson nodded, the fight completely gone from his demeanor. As he stood to leave, Chen added, and Thompson? You're lucky. 20 years ago, this kind of behavior might have been swept under the rug. Today, it could have cost you your badge. Use this time to really think about why you did what you did. As Thompson walked to his car in the precinct parking lot, he passed Officer Washington, his soon-to-be partner. Washington, a 20-year veteran of the force known for his work in community policing, gave him a long look. See you in 2 weeks, he said simply, his tone making it clear that their future partnership would be about more than just routine patrol work. The sun was setting over Chicago as Thompson drove home, the city's skyline a stark silhouette against the orange sky. His phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from family and friends who'd seen the video, but he left them unanswered. For the first time in his career, he felt the full weight of his responsibility as a police officer, not just to enforce the law, but to embody the principles of justice and equality it represented. In her courthouse office, Judge Wilson was preparing to leave for the day when her clerk brought in one last document, a formal letter from the police commissioner's office, outlining the disciplinary actions taken against Officer Thompson and proposing a joint initiative between the courthouse and police department to address institutional bias. As she read through the proposal, a small smile crossed her face. Perhaps some good would come from this difficult day after all. The incident had sparked a larger conversation throughout Chicago's legal and law enforcement communities. Town halls were being organized, training programs reassessed, and long-standing practices questioned. What had started as one officer's show of disrespect was catalyzing changes that were long overdue in the system. The first week of Officer Thompson's suspension passed slowly. His small apartment, usually just a place to sleep between shifts, now felt like a prison of his own making. The TV stayed off, he couldn't bear to see himself in the news anymore. His teenage daughter had stopped speaking to him after seeing the viral video at school, and his ex-wife's disappointed text messages went unanswered. On day 8 of his suspension, Thompson found himself sitting in a small coffee shop in his old neighborhood, the same one where he'd started his beat 15 years ago. As he stirred his coffee absently, a familiar voice caught his attention. "Mind if I join you?" Looking up, he saw retired Sergeant Davis, his first training officer, standing there with a coffee cup in hand. Before Thompson could respond, the older man had already settled into the chair across from him. "Rough couple of weeks?" Davis asked, though it wasn't really a question. His weathered face held no judgment, just the calm assessment of someone who'd seen it all during his 30 years on the force. Thompson stared into his coffee. "I've messed up before, but this..." He trailed off, unable to find the right words. "You know," Davis began, his voice low and thoughtful, "back when I was a rookie, I had this partner, older guy, old school. He used to say there were 2 kinds of mistakes in our line of work, the ones that teach you something and the ones that define you." He paused, letting the words sink in. "The trick is deciding which one this is going to be." Across town, at the courthouse, Judge Wilson was presiding over a community forum organized in response to the incident. The large conference room was packed with police officers, legal professionals, and community members. The energy in the room was intense but focused on positive change rather than confrontation. "Our goal today," Judge Wilson addressed the crowd, "is not to point fingers or assign blame. We're here to bridge gaps in understanding and create real, lasting change in our justice system. Her voice carried the same steady authority it had shown during the confrontation with Thompson, but now it was tinged with hope. In the audience, Officer Washington sat next to Captain Chen, both taking notes. They were developing the new training program that Thompson and others would soon undergo. But more than that, they were listening to community members share their experiences with law enforcement, stories of both positive interactions and painful misunderstandings. Back at the coffee shop, Davis was sharing his own experience with Thompson. "Remember when you first started? How you'd get nervous every time you had to testify in court?" He chuckled softly. "Now look at you, too comfortable, maybe. Forgot that badge means we serve everyone, not just the ones we relate to." Thompson's phone buzzed, another message from his daughter. This time, he read it. "Dad, we need to talk about what happened. Can we have dinner tonight?" Meanwhile, at the community forum, a young law student stood up to speak. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about one officer or one judge. It was about the assumptions we all carry, sometimes without even realizing it. But Judge Wilson showed us something important, that we can address these issues with dignity and create opportunities for growth. The forum continued well into the evening, producing concrete recommendations for change. Judge Wilson worked with police department representatives to establish a new protocol for courtroom conduct training. But more importantly, they created channels for ongoing dialogue between law enforcement and the community. That evening, Thompson sat across from his daughter at their favorite pizza place. The 16-year-old's face was serious as she spoke. "My history teacher used your video in class today, Dad. We talked about implicit bias and institutional racism." She paused, picking at her napkin. "I was so embarrassed. But then we discussed how people can change, how mistakes can lead to progress. I want to understand what you're learning from this." Thompson felt a lump in his throat. His daughter's words hit harder than any disciplinary action could. "I'm learning," he said quietly, "that sometimes our biggest mistakes can be our best teachers, if we're willing to listen." The next morning, Thompson found himself at the public library, researching the history of African American judges in the U.S. justice system. He read about pioneers who had faced far worse than his disrespect, yet persevered to change the system from within. Each story made his actions in the courtroom feel even more shameful, but also strengthened his resolve to do better. At the courthouse, Judge Wilson was reviewing the final draft of the new training program when her clerk brought in an unexpected letter. It was from Thompson's daughter, sharing how the incident had affected her family and thanking the judge for handling the situation in a way that allowed for learning rather than just punishment. The letter brought a moment of reflection for Judge Wilson. She thought about her own daughter, about the world they were all trying to create. The incident had been painful, but it had cracked open a door that needed to be opened. As Thompson's suspension neared its end, he received an email about his first assignment with Officer Washington, a community outreach program at a local high school. They would be speaking to students about law enforcement, bias, and the importance of mutual respect. The irony wasn't lost on him. The night before his return to duty, Thompson sat at his desk, writing in a journal, something the department counselor had suggested. 2 weeks ago, I thought I knew everything about being a police officer, he wrote. Now I realize I'm just beginning to learn what it really means to serve and protect everyone in our community. The story of the confrontation in Courtroom 304 was already becoming a case study in police training programs across the country. But in Chicago, it was becoming something more, a catalyst for genuine dialogue and change. Local news stations that had initially seized on the controversy were now covering the positive developments that had emerged from it. As the sun set over the city, both Judge Wilson and Officer Thompson were preparing for the next day, each changed by their encounter, each committed to making their brief intersection in that courtroom mean something more than just another viral video of confrontation. It was becoming a story of transformation, not just for them, but for their entire community. Thompson's first day back began before sunrise. He arrived at the precinct early, his pressed uniform feeling somehow heavier than before. The building was quiet, with only a few early shift officers preparing for their morning patrols. As he walked to his locker, the familiar smell of coffee and cleaning supplies brought back the reality of his situation. Officer Washington was already waiting by the patrol car, 2 cups of coffee in hand. He offered one to Thompson without a word. The steam rose between them in the chilly morning air, a silent acknowledgement of the challenging day ahead. "First stop is Franklin High School," Washington said, checking his notebook. "They've got an assembly about law enforcement and community relations. You're not just observing today, you're participating." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. The school auditorium was packed with students when they arrived. Thompson felt their eyes on him as he walked in, wondering if they recognized him from the viral video. Washington took the lead, addressing the students with the ease of someone who'd done this many times before. "Law enforcement isn't just about enforcing laws," Washington began, pacing the stage. "It's about building trust, understanding different perspectives, and serving all members of our community equally." He paused, looking at Thompson. Officer Thompson has a story to share about learning these lessons firsthand. Thompson's throat felt dry as he stepped forward. The microphone felt foreign in his hand, but as he looked out at the sea of young faces, he found his voice. "2 weeks ago, I made a mistake that many of you probably saw online." The auditorium fell silent. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Wilson was implementing changes of her own. She had organized a series of informal lunch meetings between judges and law enforcement officers, creating space for honest discussions about courtroom interactions and mutual respect. "The gap between law enforcement and the judiciary isn't just about protocol," she explained to her colleagues. "It's about understanding each other's roles in the justice system and recognizing our shared goal of serving the community." Back at Franklin High, Thompson was finishing his presentation. A student raised her hand. "How do you know your change is genuine and not just because you got caught?" The question hung in the air. Thompson took a deep breath. "That's a fair question. The truth is, change is a daily choice. Every morning, I have to choose to be better than I was yesterday. It's not about getting caught, it's about finally seeing yourself clearly and deciding who you want to be." Later that afternoon, Thompson and Washington responded to a domestic disturbance call. As they approached the house, Washington held Thompson back for a moment. "Remember, every interaction is a chance to show what you've learned. These people don't need to know about your past, they just need to see who you are now." The situation was tense, a family dispute that could easily escalate. Thompson found himself handling it differently than he would have before. He listened more, assumed less, and focused on understanding before acting. When they finally resolved the situation peacefully, Washington gave him a slight nod of approval. At the courthouse, Judge Wilson was reviewing cases when she received a visit from the Chief Justice of their district. "Your handling of the Thompson incident has sparked something important," he said. "We're implementing your lunch meeting program across all district courts. Sometimes it takes a moment of tension to create real change." As the day wound down, Thompson and Washington made one last stop, the community center where they would be teaching a new police community relations course. The room was filled with both officers and civilians, all part of the new initiative born from the courtroom incident. "Today, we're going to talk about unconscious bias," Washington announced to the group. "Not because any of us want to be biased, but because we all have blind spots we need to recognize." He gestured to Thompson. "Sometimes it takes a wake-up call to see them." Thompson shared his story again, but this time with fellow officers and community members. The discussion that followed was raw and honest, officers sharing their struggles with split-second decisions, community members expressing their fears and frustrations, everyone working toward better understanding. Later that night, as Thompson completed his shift paperwork, Captain Chen stopped by his desk. "Got a court appearance next week," he said, placing a folder in front of Thompson. Judge Wilson's courtroom. Thompson looked up, anxiety flickering across his face. Chen continued, "You've done good work these past few weeks, but this is your real test. Show her, and yourself, that the lesson stuck." At home that evening, Thompson's daughter was waiting up for him. "How was your first day back?" she asked, genuine concern in her voice. He told her about the school assembly, the domestic call, the community center class. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "my friends don't share that video anymore. Now they share stories about the changes happening in the department. You're part of something bigger than just a viral moment, Dad." The next morning, Judge Wilson began her day by reviewing the progress reports from the new training programs. The statistics were encouraging, improved officer court relations, fewer incidents of disrespect, more positive community feedback. But the real changes were in the daily interactions, the small moments of understanding that were gradually rebuilding trust. Thompson's story was becoming something different than what the viral video had shown. It was evolving into a testament to the possibility of change, both personal and institutional. The courthouse halls that had once been the scene of his greatest professional shame were now witnessing the results of genuine transformation. As he prepared for his upcoming court appearance, Thompson found himself reviewing not just the case details, but also everything he'd learned since that fateful day. The weight of his badge felt different now, less like a symbol of authority and more like a reminder of responsibility to every member of his community, regardless of their position or background. The morning of Thompson's return to courtroom 304 arrived with a weight of anticipation. The same marble halls that had witnessed his downfall now seemed to watch his approach with curious eyes. This time, he arrived 45 minutes early, his testimony materials carefully organized, his uniform meticulously pressed. The courthouse staff, many of whom had been present during the infamous incident, noticed the difference immediately. Thompson waited quietly on a bench outside the courtroom, reviewing his notes and occasionally nodding respectfully to passing attorneys and court officers. His demeanor was neither overly humble nor defensive, just professionally focused. Inside her chambers, Judge Wilson was also preparing for the day. Her clerk had diplomatically noted Thompson's case on the docket, though they both knew she hadn't forgotten. As she reviewed the morning's cases, she reflected on the changes she'd witnessed over the past month, not just in one officer, but throughout the justice system. "Your Honor," her clerk interrupted her thoughts, "the police commissioner's office sent over the latest statistics from the new training program. They're calling it the Wilson-Thompson Protocol now." She handed over a folder filled with preliminary data showing improved interactions between law enforcement and the judiciary across the district. At 8:55 a.m., the courtroom began to fill. Several officers from Thompson's precinct, including Officer Washington, quietly took seats in the gallery. They weren't there to intimidate or show force, their presence was supportive, curious to see how their colleague would handle this crucial moment. Local media had gotten wind of Thompson's scheduled appearance, and a few reporters sat in the back with their notepads. The story had evolved from a viral moment of shame to something more nuanced, a potential model for institutional change and personal growth. When the bailiff called the court to order, Thompson was the first to stand, his movement crisp and respectful. Judge Wilson entered, her presence commanding the same quiet authority as always. Their eyes met briefly as she took her seat, an acknowledgement without drama. "Good morning, everyone," Judge Wilson began, her voice carrying its usual measured tone. "We have a full docket today, so let's proceed efficiently." She turned to the first case, a routine traffic violation that required Thompson's testimony. As Thompson took the stand, the gallery fell silent. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, though no one quite knew what to expect. He was sworn in, and the questioning began. "Please state your name and position for the record," the prosecutor began. "Officer Richard Thompson, badge number 4571, Chicago Police Department's 15th Precinct," he responded clearly, his voice steady. What followed was a model of professional testimony, clear, concise, and respectful. When Judge Wilson asked him clarifying questions, his responses were prompt and deferential, addressing her consistently as "Your Honor." During a brief recess, Officer Washington overheard two veteran attorneys discussing the change in Thompson. "Night and day difference," one remarked. "That's what real accountability looks like." In the courthouse cafeteria, a group of young law clerks were having lunch with police cadets, part of the new exchange program that had grown out of the incident. Their conversation was animated, discussing ways to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the legal system. Back in the courtroom, as Thompson's testimony concluded, Judge Wilson addressed him directly. "Thank you for your clear and professional testimony, Officer Thompson. The court appreciates your thoroughness." The words were standard, but the moment was anything but ordinary. As Thompson stepped down from the witness stand, he paused briefly. "Thank you, Your Honor. And if I may..." He glanced at his fellow officers in the gallery before continuing, "I want to express my gratitude for the opportunity to learn and grow from my previous appearance in your courtroom." Judge Wilson nodded, her expression professional but with a hint of acknowledgement. "Growth and learning are fundamental to justice, Officer Thompson. This court exists not just to punish, but to foster understanding and improvement in our community." The afternoon session brought an unexpected development. A group of high school students on a civic education field trip filled the gallery. Their teacher had specifically requested to observe Judge Wilson's courtroom, having used the Thompson incident as a teaching tool about respect, bias, and redemption. During another recess, Thompson found himself speaking with these students in the hallway. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our best changes," he told them, his words carrying the weight of lived experience. "The key is being willing to learn from them." Later that day, at the precinct, Captain Chen called Thompson into his office. On his desk was a letter from the police commissioner's office. "They want to expand the training program," Chen explained. "Your experience, both the mistake and the recovery, is becoming a case study in police departments across the country." Thompson sat quietly, processing this information. "I never wanted to be a cautionary tale," he said finally. "You're not," Chen replied. "You're becoming an example of how to make things right." As the day drew to a close, Judge Wilson received a visit from a colleague, the judge who had mentored her early in her career. "I watched some of Thompson's testimony today," he said, settling into a chair in her chambers. "You know, 30 years ago, this kind of transformation wouldn't have been possible. We didn't have the mechanisms for it, or maybe we didn't have the will." Judge Wilson smiled thoughtfully. "Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to create an opportunity for change. The key is recognizing it when it comes." The sun was setting over Chicago as Thompson left the courthouse. The same steps he had descended in shame a month ago now felt different under his feet. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter, "Proud of you, Dad." That evening, local news coverage focused not on the drama of Thompson's return to court, but on the broader changes his incident had sparked. The story had transcended its viral beginnings to become something more meaningful, a testament to the possibility of genuine change in the justice system. 3 months after Thompson's return to Courtroom 304, the Chicago Police Department's training center was hosting representatives from police departments across the Midwest. The room buzzed with conversation as chiefs, trainers, and community leaders gathered to learn about what was now officially called the Bridge the Gap program, though everyone still informally referred to it as the Wilson-Thompson Protocol. Officer Thompson stood at the podium, no longer uncomfortable with being the center of attention. What happened in that courtroom wasn't just about disrespect, he began, scanning the faces before him. It was about the biases we carry without even realizing it. The ones that can poison our judgment if we don't acknowledge them. In the audience, Judge Wilson sat quietly, having agreed to participate in the day's presentations. She watched as Thompson shared their story, not just the viral moment of confrontation, but the transformation that followed. His presentation wasn't about shame or punishment, but about the possibility of meaningful change. The hardest part, Thompson continued, wasn't facing my superiors or even returning to court. It was looking in the mirror and admitting that I had let my badge become a shield for prejudices I didn't want to acknowledge. The room fell silent, his words striking a chord with many present. During the lunch break, Judge Wilson found herself sharing a table with police chiefs from Detroit, Milwaukee, and Indianapolis. Their conversation quickly moved beyond the specifics of the incident to larger questions about institutional culture and systemic change. The beauty of this program, the Detroit chief observed, is that it doesn't just address individual behavior. It creates a framework for ongoing dialogue between law enforcement and the judiciary. That's something we've needed for a long time. Back in the main hall, Officer Washington was leading a session on community engagement. The walls were covered with photos from recent initiatives, police officers and judges participating in town halls, youth mentorship programs, and community service projects together. These aren't just photo ops, Washington explained. They're opportunities to break down the walls we've built between our institutions and the people we serve. He gestured to a photo of Thompson coaching a youth basketball team alongside several court clerks. Real change happens in these small moments of connection. Meanwhile, at the 15th precinct, Captain Chen was meeting with a documentary filmmaker who wanted to tell the story of the department's transformation. What makes this story unique, Chen explained, is that it didn't end with an apology or a punishment. It sparked a complete reimagining of how law enforcement and the courts can work together. The filmmaker had already interviewed Thompson's daughter, who spoke about watching her father's journey from viral infamy to becoming a catalyst for change. "My dad's not perfect," she had told the camera, "but he showed me that it's never too late to learn and grow." In her chambers that evening, Judge Wilson reviewed letters from other jurisdictions requesting guidance on implementing similar programs. One letter, from a small town in Iowa, particularly caught her attention. They had faced their own incident of bias, but instead of letting it divide their community, they were using the Wilson-Thompson protocol as a blueprint for healing. Thompson's role had evolved as well. He now split his time between regular patrol duties and training work, sharing his experience with police academies and departments across the country. His story had become a powerful tool for opening difficult conversations about bias and accountability in law enforcement. The key, he told a group of police cadets, is understanding that respect isn't about rank or position. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone we interact with, whether they're wearing a judge's robe or handcuffs. The program's success was showing up in the data. Complaints about officer conduct in court had dropped significantly, and surveys showed increased trust between law enforcement and the judiciary. But the real changes were evident in the daily interactions that never made headlines. At a community center in Chicago's South Side, Thompson and Judge Wilson found themselves co-presenting at a youth forum. The teenagers in attendance had seen the viral video, but now they were more interested in hearing about what happened after, how a moment of conflict became a catalyst for change. One young woman raised her hand. "Did you ever think your mistake would lead to something positive?" she asked Thompson. He glanced at Judge Wilson before responding. "No, but that's the thing about mistakes, they're only failures if you don't learn from them. Sometimes they can be the beginning of something important." Judge Wilson nodded in agreement. "Change doesn't always come from getting everything right," she added. "Sometimes it comes from being willing to acknowledge and we get things wrong and doing the hard work to make them right." The success of the program had attracted attention from national police reform advocates and judicial organizations. What started as a courthouse confrontation had evolved into a model for institutional change, proving that meaningful reform didn't always require legislation or court orders, sometimes it could grow from individual transformation. Back at the training center, the day's sessions were wrapping up. Thompson stood with Judge Wilson as they watched the visiting officials file out, many already on their phones making plans to implement similar programs in their jurisdictions. "Did you ever imagine this?" Thompson asked quietly. Judge Wilson shook her head. "No, but that's how progress often works. It starts with one moment, one decision to do better." She paused, watching a group of young officers deep in discussion about the day's presentations. "The real test isn't what happened in my courtroom that day. It's what happens in all the courtrooms and police stations where this story is inspiring people to examine their own biases." That evening, local news covered the training center event, but the story wasn't about conflict anymore. It was about transformation, not just of one officer or one department, but of an entire approach to justice and community relations. The viral video that had once embodied division now served as a reminder that change was possible, even in the most entrenched systems. 6 months after the training center event, Thompson stood in his dress uniform before a packed auditorium in Washington, D.C. The Department of Justice had invited him and Judge Wilson to speak at a national conference on judicial reform and law enforcement relations. The audience included attorney generals, police commissioners, and chief justices from across the country. As Thompson approached the podium, he caught sight of his daughter in the front row, sitting beside Officer Washington and Captain Chen. She beamed with pride, a far cry from the disappointed teenager who had once stopped speaking to him over his viral moment of shame. "A year ago," Thompson began, his voice steady and clear, "I stood in a Chicago courtroom and made a choice that could have ended my career. Instead, thanks to the wisdom of Judge Wilson and the support of my department, it became the beginning of something much bigger than myself." The presentation screen behind him showed statistics from departments that had adopted the Wilson-Thompson protocol, reduced incidents of courtroom confrontations, improved community relations, and increased trust between law enforcement and the judiciary. But more compelling were the personal stories, officers and judges working together on community initiatives, youth mentorship programs flourishing, and barriers breaking down across the justice system. Judge Wilson sat on the panel, watching Thompson with quiet satisfaction. When it was her turn to speak, she focused on the broader implications of their story. "What happened in my courtroom that day wasn't unique," she explained. "What was unique was our collective decision to use it as a catalyst for meaningful change." During the conference lunch break, Thompson found himself surrounded by officers from various departments, each eager to share their own experiences with implementing the protocol. A veteran sergeant from Texas pulled him aside. "You know what's different about your program?" he said. "It's not just about avoiding mistakes, it's about transforming the whole culture of how we interact with the justice system." Meanwhile, Judge Wilson was meeting with a group of law school deans who wanted to incorporate the protocol into their curriculum. "Future lawyers and judges need to understand their role in building bridges," she explained. "The courtroom shouldn't be a battleground between law enforcement and the judiciary, it should be where we come together to serve justice." Back in Chicago, the changes continued to ripple through the community. The 15th Precinct had become a model for other departments, hosting regular open houses where citizens could meet officers and court officials in informal settings. The courthouse, once an intimidating symbol of authority, was increasingly seen as a place of community engagement and positive change. Thompson's daughter had started a youth program at her high school, bringing together students interested in law enforcement and legal careers. "My dad's story taught me that change doesn't just happen in big moments," she told her group. "It happens in daily choices to do better, to be better." The documentary about the department's transformation was nearing completion. The filmmaker had captured not just the obvious changes in protocol and procedure, but the subtle shifts in attitude and interaction that marked real cultural change. One powerful scene showed Thompson and Judge Wilson co-teaching a class at the police academy, their once adversarial relationship transformed into a partnership for progress. During a break at the conference, Thompson received an unexpected call from his ex-wife. "I saw you on the morning news," she said. "Remember how worried we were that this would be the end of your career?" Now look at you, you're helping change the whole system. The conference's final day featured a roundtable discussion where Thompson and Judge Wilson shared the stage with other changemakers in the justice system. The conversation went beyond their specific protocol to address broader questions of institutional reform and community healing. The real success, Judge Wilson observed, isn't in the programs we've created or the statistics we've improved. It's in the conversations that are happening in precincts and courthouses across the country. People are finally talking about the uncomfortable truths we need to face to create real change. Thompson nodded in agreement. Every day, I meet officers who tell me they've had their own moment of revelation, maybe not as public as mine, but just as important. They're learning to question their assumptions, to see beyond the badge or the bench to the humanity we all share. The conference concluded with the announcement of a national initiative to implement the Wilson-Thompson Protocol in judicial districts across the country. The Department of Justice had allocated funding for training and implementation, recognizing the program's potential to transform relationships between law enforcement and the judiciary. As Thompson packed up his materials, a young officer approached him. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "I had my own moment like yours last month. Not as dramatic, but I caught myself making assumptions about a judge based on, well, you know. Thanks to your story, I knew what to do about it." That evening, at a small dinner celebration, Thompson's daughter raised her glass. "To my dad," she said, "who taught me that our worst moments don't have to define us, they can redefine us, if we're brave enough to learn from them." Judge Wilson added her own toast. "To the power of transformation, not just of individuals, but of institutions. And to the courage it takes to be the first to change." As they left the conference center, Thompson and Judge Wilson paused on the steps, looking out over the capital city. "You know," Thompson said, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you'd just thrown the book at me that day." Judge Wilson smiled. "Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about seeing the possibility for change and having the courage to nurture it." She paused, watching the sunset paint the sky. "Besides, look what happened instead, we're helping rewrite the book." The story of the confrontation in Courtroom 304 had evolved far beyond its viral beginnings. It was no longer just about one officer's disrespect or one judge's response, it had become a blueprint for transformation, a reminder that change was possible even in the most entrenched systems, if people were willing to do the hard work of making it happen. 1 year to the day after the viral courtroom incident, the Chicago Police Department and Cook County Courthouse hosted a special ceremony. The newly established Police Judicial Relations Center, housed in a renovated building between the courthouse and police headquarters, was being dedicated. The symbolic location wasn't lost on anyone, a bridge between two institutions that had often seemed worlds apart. Thompson stood in the crowd, now comfortable in the spotlight that had once burned him. His daughter stood beside him, having just announced her decision to study law after graduating high school. "You inspired me, Dad," she had told him that morning. "Not because you were perfect, but because you showed me what real change looks like." Judge Wilson delivered the opening address, her words carrying the weight of experience and hope. "A year ago, a moment of disrespect in my courtroom could have deepened the divide between our institutions. Instead, it became a catalyst for understanding. This center stands as a testament to the power of transformation, both personal and institutional." The center would serve as the national headquarters for the Wilson-Thompson Protocol, now implemented in over 200 jurisdictions across the country. But it was more than just a training facility. Its doors were open to the community, hosting programs that brought together law enforcement, legal professionals, and citizens in an ongoing dialogue about justice and mutual respect. Captain Chen, recently promoted to deputy commissioner, shared the department's latest statistics. Complaints about officer conduct in court had dropped by 70%. Community trust ratings had reached historic highs. But more importantly, the culture had shifted. Officers and judges regularly collaborated on community initiatives, mentor programs flourished, and the us versus them mentality was fading. Officer Washington, now heading the department's Community Relations Division, had developed a curriculum that was being adopted by police academies nationwide. "We're not just training officers to avoid mistakes," he explained to a group of visitors. "We're teaching them to be active participants in building a more equitable justice system." During the ceremony, a surprise announcement came from the state governor's office: the establishment of the Wilson Thompson Scholarship, designed to support students pursuing careers in law enforcement or legal studies, with a focus on building bridges between communities and the justice system. The documentary about the department's transformation premiered that evening in the center's auditorium. The filmmaker had captured not just the big moments of change, but the small, daily interactions that showed how deeply the transformation had taken root. One particularly moving scene showed Thompson teaching a class of new recruits, sharing his story not with shame, but with purpose. "Your badge isn't just a symbol of authority," he told them. "It's a reminder of your responsibility to serve everyone with equal respect and dignity. I had to learn that lesson the hard way, but you have the opportunity to start your careers with that understanding." Judge Wilson, watching from the back of the room, reflected on how far they'd come. The viral video that had once threatened to define both their careers now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by countless stories of positive change and growth. After the screening, a community reception brought together people from all walks of life: officers, judges, community leaders, and citizens. The conversations weren't about division or distrust, but about continuing the work of building bridges and understanding. Thompson's ex-wife, attending with their daughter, pulled him aside. "Remember when you used to say you couldn't change the system?" she asked. "Look at what you've helped create." Their daughter joined them, proudly wearing a pre-law program t-shirt from her college visit. Later that evening, Thompson found himself back in Courtroom 304, now designated as a historical landmark in the story of police-judicial relations. The room was quiet, the evening light casting long shadows through the high windows. Judge Wilson found him there, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts, Officer Thompson," she asked, her voice carrying the same authority it had that fateful day, but now tempered with warmth born of shared purpose. "Just thinking about how different things might have been," he replied. "If you had responded with anger instead of wisdom that day, if I had let pride stop me from learning, if the department had chosen punishment over transformation." Judge Wilson nodded, understanding the weight of those possibilities. "That's why we share this story," she said. "Not to focus on the mistake, but to show that change is always possible when we choose to learn and grow." The center's opening made national news, but the real story wasn't in the headlines. It was in the daily interactions between officers and judges, in the community programs that brought people together, in the young people inspired to pursue careers in justice with a new understanding of what that meant. Thompson's daughter had started a blog documenting the changes she witnessed, sharing stories of officers and judges working together to build trust in their communities. Her latest post, titled "How My Dad's Worst Day Became His Best Legacy," had gone viral, not for controversy, but for hope. The final scene of the documentary showed Thompson and Judge Wilson co-teaching a class at the center. On the screen behind them, the old viral video played briefly before transitioning to footage of the positive changes it had sparked. The contrast was stark: a moment of disrespect transformed into a movement for understanding. "The easy part is admitting you were wrong," Thompson told the camera in the closing interview. "The hard part is doing the work to make it right. But that's where real change happens, in the daily choice to do better, to be better, to build something better." Judge Wilson's final words in the film captured the essence of their journey. Justice isn't just about following rules or maintaining order. It's about recognizing our common humanity and working together to create a system that serves everyone with dignity and respect. Sometimes it takes a moment of crisis to show us the way forward. As the center's opening day drew to a close, Thompson stood with his daughter on the building steps, watching the sunset over Chicago. "You know what I learned from all this?" he said to her. "Change isn't just about fixing what's broken. It's about imagining something better and having the courage to build it." The story of Courtroom 304 had become more than a cautionary tale or even a success story. It had become a blueprint for transformation, a reminder that even our worst moments can lead to our greatest contributions if we're willing to learn, grow, and work together for change.